good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Just a wonderful privilege from my side as well to be spending some time with you all again, start of a new year. And folks, we've changed the order of our webinars this year. It's a big year for us this year with the introduction of the new ISA315. And we've just decided that we need to get this information out as soon as possible, because we know and have already been in touch with a few clients that are starting some December year-end audits already, and they have to be compliant with the new ISA315 as they hit those audits. So yes, we are maybe doing things a little bit differently, and on Thursday we're going to be having a general RAC webinar as well. But these ISA315 changes are critical. We just decided that this needs to be our focus as we get the year rolling, so that any firms that are working on any existing audits or just about to start any audits, you guys are up and running, ready to go with the new year. So with me this afternoon and doing most of the presenting today will be Janita Miller and Dillian McDonald. Janita's face might be familiar to many of you. She's been presenting in the past, has been doing a lot of training. So if you've had any RAC training in the last few years, even some Draftworx training, Janita's been the person that's been in touch with you. It's a great pleasure to invite Dillian McDonald. She's joined our team towards the end of last year. Dillian was part of the original team that wrote RAC more than 10 years ago now, initially. So it's been wonderful to have her on board for this ISA315 update. It's probably one of the most significant updates we've done to RAC, and I think it's one that is going to impact the majority, well, going to have the biggest impact on audit in a long time. So those of you, I see one or two questions are popping up already. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please pop onto the Q&A and pop those questions up. We will then either answer you directly, or if there are some pertinent ones that we want to just discuss with everybody, we'll just raise those questions in the general discussion forum. So please do shout as we go along. Damien, been with the team for many years as well. Sorry, he's got some issues with his camera. I know he's waving wildly in the darkness from his screen there. Been on the team with us as well. He's been doing a lot of the actual programming of the spreadsheets during this process. So we're all on hand to assist each other, answer questions as they may come up, and just take you through the updates. Now, there are some of you who've maybe not used RAC before and have been using Audit Lite. I think by way maybe as general introduction, RAC started 10 years ago. We needed to build an automated audit process within Draftworx. And in the past, we had something called Audit Lite. And we took Audit Lite and said, look, let's update this, let's review this, let's improve this. And we came up with RAC, which stands for Risk Assessment per Component. And the idea and the goal behind RAC was to now build a methodology that it's no longer just filling in blank cells. We're actually doing stuff with information. We're processing information, and we're carrying information across between different working papers. Audit Lite Plus was then brought about. We did a bit of an update to Audit Lite to make it Audit Lite Plus. We brought in some of the automations, but RAC was then positioned as the premium methodology within Draftworx. There was an additional fee that we charged for it. Then along came ISA315, and we began development firstly within RAC. And we realized the nature of the changes was just such that it became impossible for us to see and scope an Audit Lite Plus that still contained all of the requirements of ISA315. We couldn't see that there was a reasonable way for us to do an update to Audit Lite Plus. And so with that, and you'd have seen if you saw our year-end mailer, we are in the process of discontinuing Audit Lite Plus. It's still available as a methodology and can still be used for audits for years commencing before 16 December 2021. So in other words, any older files that you might still need to audit, you can still audit with Audit Lite Plus because ISA315 is not yet a requirement. But especially if you've got a December 2022 year end, those need to have the ISA315 compliance, and therefore we do need to switch over to RAC in your case. And that's why we made the decision that we would no longer charge for RAC going forward, so that if you are a previous user just of Audit Lite Plus and didn't have RAC, you can immediately start creating files with RAC so that you have the compliance available for you. Just on a note, we have now released the files with RAC with all the ISA 315 requirements included, but you might come across a November year end, for instance, of 2022 that you need to audit, where ISA 315 is maybe not applicable yet. The problem is it's very difficult for us to now have two different methodologies, one pre and one post. Managing those files, managing those engagements becomes very difficult from a program side. So our suggestion and our discussion would be to discuss that with us if you are in that situation. Our preference would be that you say, okay, we're going to early adopt ISA 315 for this audit, so that at least you're running audits that are following the same processes. You're not sitting with audits running on different approaches within your firm. If you don't want to do that, if you don't want to do the early adoption, please get in touch with us and we can see how to assist you with just rolling forward that file still with the older RAC files, with the older RAC methodology, so that you're not forced into a situation. But please do have a look at it on a case-by-case basis. The other major change, folks, that unfortunately ISA 315 has brought about is that for a while we are discontinuing the RAC micro option within RAC. Now, I know we previously said the RAC micro is there to help firms scale their methodology a little bit for less complex entities. But if you are following the audit world at all, you'll know when I say that term, less complex entities, there's actually a new standard in the works specifically for the audits of less complex entities. And the type and nature of changes that we see with RAC micro are just with RAC, with ISA 315, we just don't see space for a RAC micro at this stage. There's significant changes in how we address risks, how we look at risks, how we document information. And so for now, unfortunately, all audits are going to be treated as the same. They are all audits. Once the less complex entity standard has been released, we will definitely open this discussion up internally and go and have a look. Are there ways for us to implement some sort of a RAC micro? We will then start looking at whether it's something we still build in, like we did with RAC micro, or whether we need to look at a completely new methodology for less complex entities. Those decisions will really just be based on what the final content looks like. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I stand under correction here, but I think the original draft was sent out with request for comment by January of last year. But to date, all that we've seen on the IAASB's website has been that the revision is in progress. They have not yet finalized the new standard. What that means in terms of when it will be implemented and what the implementation dates will be, we don't know. What we do see is IRBA has been fairly active in communications around less complex entities. So we are hoping that IRBA will be fairly quick in adopting once that standard is released. And then we can already start having discussions about whether it's possible to early adopt and all those sort of things. There are a lot of unanswered questions. So we unfortunately at this stage can't give any conclusive answers to those things. But please understand that at this stage, the realities for us is that RAC micro it doesn't fit into what we've done with ISA 315. However, folks, don't be too dejected. The reality is the questions are now there that weren't there before with RAC micro, but not applicable is still a valid answer for you to give during the audit process. You at least then are showing to IRBA, if they ever review that file, that you are considering the questions. Even if the answer is not applicable, we're at least showing that there's something some thought that was put in place. Now, Delian, during the rest of the presentation, will focus a lot more on the theoretical, Janito more on the practical aspects of the new working papers, and we are largely going to be focusing on the changes now. And then, as I said, on Thursday, we'll have a more general RAC training session, which will then incorporate all the new documents, all the new formats, all the new layouts for any users that are either new to Draftworx or have been existing Draftworx users but haven't used RAC before. Please make a point of attending that session. But as was mentioned, we are recording these. We will make them available on YouTube, and we will be rolling out further training as we go during the year and as we develop further. So folks, from my side, that's going to be all I'm going to do by way of introduction. And then Delian, thank you very much. Folks, as I say, please shout if there are questions, use that Q&A button. We'd be very happy to assist. Thanks, folks. I'll sign off for now.
Thanks, Leon. Welcome to everybody. As Leon has indicated, this change to the audit approach is really a major change, and we are actually quite excited about it. But just quickly, if we go through the index, what we're going to deal with today, the first two topics would be very short. It is the new colors in RAC. Then I'll quickly take you through ISA315 that we've earlier adopted. Then the major part of the presentation will deal with ISA315 and the impact specifically on RAC and the risk flows throughout the audit. Leon has dealt with the questions and answers, so please, as we go along, post your questions. Good. Those of you who have been using the financial statement template, you will be familiar with the color changes, but I just quickly want to run through them. When you see dark gray, it in the working papers would be headings or specific action steps. You know, the action steps, each and every working paper has various action steps following onto one another. Light gray is for secondary headings or ISA requirements or specific questions. The input cells is starting with light blue. You can input anything in there, even a not applicable, should that be the case. Dark blue cells is roll forward. Now, you know how the roll forward is using whatever you type in now will roll forward to your next year audit. Yellow cells are required input cells. So if you don't put something in there, the working paper will either not work properly or it won't do the background calculations as required, and you might not be able to go on to another working paper, or it might show you some error messages. If you see red, it shows that there's incorrect input in that cell. So please delete whatever you've put in a red cell. Go back, see what's the requirement, and make sure that you put in the right information in that cell. When you see something that's white, that's either information that has been automatically calculated or a result of a process. Those cells are usually locked so that they can't be changed. And then lastly, the tan cells is if we want to communicate some information or a warning message that you need to be aware of. Those cells will not print, but please make sure that you read them and follow the guidance in those cells. Okay, if we quickly go over to the next slide. So ISA315 on quality assurance, we've decided to early adopt the standard. For the reason therefore is it has the same effective date as ISQM2. So when you and your audit firms are implementing ISQM2, you know that although it will only be applicable to audits finishing by 15 December 2023, The working papers are already updated, so you can refer to that in your firm documentation. On the updates, we found that it wasn't big updates. There's a list of the working papers where updates have been made, but in most of the instances, it was terminology that changed. For instance, in working paper 1010, instead of the old QCR, which it's now only your engagement quality review, EQR. Other changes might, for instance, be the reference to engagement partner instead of just partner. So there are the working papers. To be honest, I doubt that you would even realize that there's some changes on those working papers. And for that reason, we are not going to go into detail in this presentation. Okay, if we can go to the next one. Okay, ISA315. I think Leon has already addressed quite a few of these points. I just want to reiterate the effective date is for audits of financial statement periods beginning on or after December 2021, meaning that the year ends of applicable audits would be December 2022. And if you have old audit, as Leon has said, you can decide to either early adopt or contact support. Now, there has been major changes in how the risks flow through an audit, what you have to do regarding risks, significant risks or non-significant risks, and it really has a major impact on the audit. To that extent, I'm pretty sure that all auditing software, whether it is internally developed in a firm or like us, third-party development, will have to update their working papers and streamline it to get it in line with ISA 315. So what we're going to discuss further on is a summary of the major changes. We will take you through the working papers as well so that you can see how the working papers actually look and just get familiar with the look and feel. So the first one that I just want to mention, and this is not an ISA 315 update, it's just a quality enhancement that we've made. So on the working paper 1020, where you identify your audit sections applicable to the audit. There you also need to determine if a specific materiality basis might be applicable to a specific component. This is usually in very rare cases, but should it be applicable, you can select the basis on that working paper. Let's say, for instance, your overall materiality basis was expenditure, but for a specific component, you need a specific materiality based on the user expectations, which would rather be on total assets. You select the base there, the specific base, and what changed now is on your schedule of identified misstatements, that selected base now automatically pulls through, so you don't have to reselect the bases in your schedule of identified misstatements, creating an opportunity for misstatements and even a wrong audit opinion. Okay, Janita is just quickly going to show you how the working paper looks. Thanks, Janita.
Okay, cool. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So this is working paper 1020, except for the very nice color changes that we've brought onto 1020, you will all be still familiar with the layout of this working paper. So action 5 is where Dalena specifically mentioned which materiality basis should be used, and you can change that according to your preference for a specific section. Okay, but same old, we still have our information from the working trial balance, still depending on whether it's quantitatively material or qualitatively material. identifying the sections that's applicable in the audit. So you won't actually find a lot of changes to this working paper, except for the one where we now can select the materiality basis to use. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Anita. Now, this is kind of important. We've listed the working papers that has been totally deleted out of the audit file, so please don't expect them to see them again. The first one, which is quite important, is 1015. That was the audit type selection. Now, in that working paper, you could have indicated was it a small, a medium, or a large audit, and that reduced some of your planning working papers for small audits. Because ISA315 is applicable to all entities, that is not available anymore. So as Leon has explained, we will have to look at the full working papers now. Just hereafter, we'll show you an example and how you can complete that working paper, especially if certain sections is not applicable. The other impact for the deletion of this working paper is regarding to the assertions. You don't have a choice anymore to select assertions, a full set or combined assertions. We are now using the assertions as per ISA315, and it's pretty similar to the combined assertions. In a later slide, we'll look specifically at those. The next working paper that's deleted is 1275, the overall fraud risk assessment. Due to the changes in ISA315, all significant risks are now treated similar, and fraud risks are automatic significant risks. So we do not need to treat fraud risks different anymore in our audit approach. They can now follow the same route through the risk identification and assessment as any other risk that is significant. It is, however, very important in the audit approach to keep track of significant risks, because significant risks are treated a little bit different. Just put it in the back of your minds, but as we go through the working papers, I will reiterate where that is applicable. Then working paper 1295, that was the risk identification signed off. We have renumbered it to 1795. So you can see that it has moved down in the audit approach. The reason for that is there needs to be full risk identification and assessment before we can go through to the audit programs. So 1795, much later, that needs to be signed off for the audit programs to populate. The next two working papers, 1505 and 1605, the fraud RAC and the business RAC, has been totally deleted. They do not exist anymore, but we have repurposed the numbers. So 1505 would now be the risk register, and 1605 would be the RAC summary. As I've indicated previously, we do not deal with the fraud risks and business risks separately. They follow the same process. The only difference is that fraud risks are regarded as significant risks, and all significant risk is treated in a similar way. Then the last one, and that is also a big impact, 7020. You will recall that previously on RAC, where you had a look at your components on 1020 to see whether they are material or not. What happened was all immaterial components was already at the beginning of planning scoped out to say that you're not going to do any work on those immaterial components. The immaterial components then went to 7020, where you only performed completeness tests on those immaterial components. This has materially changed with ISA315, where it now means we cannot scope out immaterial components that early in the audit process, in the planning process. All components, whether they are material or immaterial, has to go through the entire planning process, the risk identification and risk assessment process, and only after the risk has been assessed and we need to determine how to react to that risk, only at that point in time the extent of testing for immaterial components can be reduced, but we'll also discuss that in detail a bit later. So I think let's go on to, yes, the new working papers. So you will see brand new working papers, and I really want to urge you to forget how the old working papers looked or worked. Totally forget what you know about risk identification and assessment and just focus on the new working papers. So the first part is you will see we've got a brand new section 13. In the past, the system notes was in each cycle part of the index documents. That has been deleted, those systems from the index documents for every component. And all the system notes are now together in section 13. The other one, as that I've already mentioned, is 1505, the new risk register. Basically, all risks identified during the planning, with one exception, and we will talk about the exception later, go to the risk register where it's being assessed as either significant risks or not significant risks, and then treated further in the audit approach. Your 1605, the RAC Summary, deals now with all the risks per component that are not significant risks. So those component risks are separately evaluated. Then it goes to 1705, which is the audit plan. In 1705, we will look at the nature, timing, and extent of the work that needs to be done and the allocation for responsibilities in the audit plan. And then lastly, the one that I've already discussed, the old 1295, went to 1795, where you need to sign off your audit, your planning part before you go to your audit programs. The last point here that I think is actually quite important, and I really want you to take note of it. For all of these new working papers that we are going to discuss today, some with major changes and these ones that's brand new, we have compiled detailed guidance. Maybe if we just go to the next slide to give you an example, we've got the objective of the working paper, training videos will populate as we go along, and then it starts with your guidance. You'll see, for instance, there is 150501, which means that this working paper has more than one sheet. So on the first sheet, 150501, we will list the action steps and we discuss in detail, sometimes with a bit of theory, but what you need to do for each action step, even what you need to be aware of. We've put in some warnings. You'll see there's specific notes that's italic that you need to take note of. So I want to urge you, if you start a working paper and things does not look familiar, go to the guidance, read through it, and well, we hope that it will help you and that you don't get stuck. If you do get stuck, you're welcome to call support, but I think your first port of call would be the guidance. Okay, just a few concepts that I want to take you through, and why I'm doing that is so that you know that these items or requirements in the ISAs have been addressed in the working papers and where it has been addressed. So when RAC started, there wasn't a lot of focus on controls. but with ISA 315, we have to look at controls, the control environment. So the control environment, the entity risk assessment process, and the entity's process to monitor the system of internal control, all of those requirements is now in working paper 1240. We will go through that a little bit later. That working paper is your entity control working paper. So it's overall controls, dealing with management attitudes, all of the overarching, or I sometimes call them umbrella risks. Then also information systems and communication and control activities. The information systems and communications working paper 1245 has been enhanced quite a bit. So we've changed the name, we've added some additional information or additional sheet for application systems. We'll go through that. And then lastly, the control activities, that is in the system notes. So you can see your entire system of internal control, those 3 or 2 working papers and 1 section, 1240, 1245, and all the system notes in section 13 is extremely important, because throughout the audit approach, you will see where you need to decide, can you do test of controls? Do you want to do test of controls? And some of the factors that you need to consider is whether the control environment is actually functioning or not. If you've got a situation where your control environment or your general IT controls are not in place, then you don't want to rely on controls, and you don't want to test controls because it could be risky, as the overarching controls will not pick up misstatements or errors. Okay, that's the one concept. The other concept that you'll see in the statement is the risk of material misstatement. Okay, now the risk of material misstatement, I think in the past we just said it is a risk that we identify. I think it's important that we just know that there's 2 levels. It is my overall risk at financial statement level and risk at assertion level. Now, my risk at financial statement level relate pervasively to the financial statements as a whole and potentially affect many assertions. Okay, so that would be a risk that you cannot link directly to a component or assertion. Your risk at assertion level, that is specifically to a component that you can link that risk. What is important there, your risk at assertion level deals with inherent risk that comes from your planning working papers. Now, just something to take note of, in the past, on the planning working papers, we always had the terminology business risk and fraud risk. If you need to, you identify a risk and then you classify them as either. We've decided not to change the business risk, but business risk and inherent risk can be used interchangeably for our purposes, but we kept it business risk just because everybody is familiar with that description. Then the control risk, you will determine on the system notes whether the controls are working or not and what is the risk associated with that, and that will then pull through further in our risk assessment. Okay, let's go through to the first working paper with a big impact from ISA 315. This is 1210, understanding the nature of the entity. Now, although we have inserted some additional requirements from the statement, I think the big change here is that this working paper cannot be scaled down anymore, because in the past, if you selected on 1015 that it's a small audit, the working paper scaled down dramatically. That is not available anymore. So the working paper is standard, where it's a small or a big entity. I need to warn you, it is quite big. However, we've tried to help you as much as possible. So for each of those sections, we've already listed some inherent risk factors that could be applicable to help you in identifying your risks. The other thing is certain areas, especially to small entities, might just not be applicable. Please indicate not applicable there. And then the third thing that can help you is the roll forward cells. So if you've used the full working paper in the past, that information will automatically roll forward. And if you complete it properly this year, it will roll forward to your next year's audit. Just one thing that I want you to please remember regarding roll forward cells is you have to reassess to see if that information that rolled forward is actually still applicable to the current year audit. Okay. Don't just accept the roll forward cells as the truth. Okay. And then lastly, we have maintained the look and feel of when you identify a risk, you immediately on the working paper need to classify it as either a business risk or a fraud risk. This is applicable to all the planning working papers, and the risks that you identify on the planning working papers will automatically be taken to 1505, the risk register, where it will then be assessed further risk by risk. So I think, Janita, quickly take us through 1210, please.
1210, the understanding of the nature of business. So for those of you that worked on RAC Micro in the past, this document will scare you a little bit, but rest assured it's very informative, and we feel that after you've completed this working paper, you will have an in-depth understanding of the nature of entity. Okay, so this working paper was impacted by both the fact that RAC Micro has now been deleted for the interim, and also by the audit type selection 1015 that was deleted from the working papers. So you'll remember in 1015 you actually could select the level of detail to be included in your working papers. So for those of you that selected a high level of detail, this working paper will be exactly the same that you are used to. But for those that used a low or low to moderate level of detail, you will find a lot of empty cells upon roll forward of your old file into the new RAC. Okay, but it's quite nice to use. You will see this is the dark blue cells that we referred to earlier, the roll forward cells. And then these over here, the light blue cells, will be the cells that you have to document every single year. So fortunately, a lot of the content of this working paper is being shaded dark blue. So that's a very good thing. And also the structure of this working paper, for those that have used this working paper in the full level of detail before, you guys can just sit back a little bit. But for those of you that this is very new to, I just want to show you from a bird's eye view how this works. So it's broken up into action steps like all of our working papers, and then we treat section by section. So firstly, this is based on the organization and the group structure. So you'll have to document a lot of detail around the company and how the group has been structured, and the shareholders and the percentages owned, etc. Then we give you a few risk factors to consider. So you need to read through them, and you need to consider whether they are applicable to your entity or not. Okay, please be aware that these are shaded light blue. So risk assessment needs to be done every single year. We can't roll that forward for you, so it's not a mistake. You need to do that every single year. So please keep in mind that that is the biggest part that should be done on this working paper on an annual basis. For today, I've just selected 3 risks for us. We are going to look how that is taken through RAC when we reach the 1505 risk register. But just so that you have a bird's eye view. We ask some questions, you provide the answer, and we give you possible risk factors to consider. That is the biggest or the most important thing you should know about this working paper, is the way it's structured. And then also please review this working paper on an annual basis. Especially it asks about, like, for example, the head of IT and head of manufacturing. If that person retired or they resign and there is a new person appointed in that role, I mean, of course, those details will have to be updated. So please keep this working paper updated and complete it as complete as possible, because once you've rolled this working paper forward, you will reap the benefits of it in your upcoming audits.
Okay, the next two working papers that we're going to discuss is 1240 and 1245. So the entity level controls and the IT controls, which include the general IT controls and application systems. Now, when we look at the working papers, you will see that they follow the same pattern. Both of them, if you think about entity level controls or IT controls or IT general controls, if you think about the level of controls, remember we've got financial statement level risks and we've got risk at the assertion level. Both of these working papers predominantly address financial statement level risk. There might be, in the odd instance, where while you are going through the working papers, that you do identify a risk at the assertion level. We've provided for that at the very bottom of the working paper, where you identify the assertion level risks. The assertion level risks will go to 1505, whereas the the financial statement level risks would be addressed on the working paper. So there you will have to indicate what is the overall response to that risk and where and how you will implement that overall response to the risk. Now, just before we go to the working paper, I just want to tell you, in both of these working papers, you will have to, for the controls that you identify, do a walkthrough test. And remember, with the walkthrough test, the detail of documentation that is required. So somebody else needs to be able to reperform that walkthrough test and come to the same conclusions as you did. So you need to be specific. What is the document that you looked at, or the policy, whatever the case might be. So you have to evaluate then the design of that control, whether it is adequate or not, and the implementation of that control. Should either the design or the implementation not be adequate, there is a possibility that there could be a risk. It might be just a control weakness because you think that there are other controls that could catch that specific control. But if there is a risk, identify the risk, determine if it's a business risk or a fraud risk, and then immediately select the overall response and document where it has been addressed. Lastly, on the working paper is the control conclusion. Yalnita will go in detail through that, and that is an extremely important part of the working paper, because for entity controls, you need to determine, are those controls in place, and is the control environment such that it provides assurance that if we want to do test of controls, that is a safe environment to do it in. Especially in small entities, one would expect that a lot of the entity controls might not be there. Part of the conclusion, you need to apply your mind to determine if the controls that are there, are they sufficient for that particular entity or not. If you should conclude that entity level controls are not in place, or the general IT controls are not in place or not effective, it will definitely have a impact on, could you even consider doing tested controls? Okay, so Janita is quickly going to take us through 1240. Thanks, Janita.
Cool. Okay, so 1240, a working paper that we are familiar with, except for we've added a lot of detail to this working paper. So on the left-hand side over here, we have some controls listed for you. You need to read the controls and ultimately document your understanding of that specific entity level controls. Okay, then you need to perform a walkthrough on that control that you've identified, basically testing, in inverted commas, what management has told you is indeed there. So please remember, doing a walkthrough and concluding on these yeses over here does not mean you now tested the controls. It only means that you observed and inspected that whatever management told you was in place. So firstly, designed adequately. So will it address a specific risk or a specific issue? And then secondly, is the implementation adequate? Okay, so it's walkthrough testing. It's not test of controls. Okay, so firstly, over here, is the control design adequate? I've done 2 examples for us. This one, yes. Second one, also yes. What management told me will be there was indeed there. Secondly, is the control appropriately implemented? Okay, so does the control work in the sense that it's implemented? It covers what it needs to cover. So firstly, the first one is a yes. I'm going to say this control is appropriately implemented. And then the second one, I'm going to say no, just so that you know what needs to happen with that specific control further. So let's focus on the first one. Oops. Okay. So conclude if test of controls can be performed. So do you see now, only after the walkthrough do we start evaluating whether it would be feasible to do test of controls. We can't test controls on an environment that's not working. Okay, so this control environment is, the design is adequate and it's implemented appropriately. So yes, I will be able to test these controls. So it's grayed out. You don't need to do anything on that specific control further. The second one, no. This control, don't even waste your time to test it. So firstly, you need to reference to where the control weakness was communicated to management. And then secondly, you need to document your financial statement level risk. Now, keeping in mind what Aline said is we are busy with entity level controls, not controls that can be related to a specific component. So not a risk that can be related to a specific component, but overall entity level controls. There you go. Overall financial statement level risks. Okay, so document your overall financial statement level risk over here and then assess whether that is a risk of material misstatement. Also keeping in mind what Aline said is we are now busy identifying risks that can cause material misstatements, not just every other risk that we can think of. Then we need to indicate whether it's a business or a fraud risk, and we need to develop a response, ultimately to cover that risk. Okay, so we have built a drop-down with a few responses that you can select from. So I've selected the one that says providing more supervision. Now, please keep in mind that these responses need to be evidenced. Okay, so it's not just, oh, okay, I'm providing more supervision. I'll ask the manager just to review the work and then later on forgetting about it. These need to be evidence. So we assist you in evidencing and documenting it appropriately. Firstly, you need to describe how the overall response will be addressed. Okay, so document your action. Whatever action you are going to take to ensure that this response is executed. And then also refer to where the overall response has been implemented. So in 1705-02, there's quite a nice sheet, we'll show you that later on, where you need to assign your team. So you need to assign the components to specific team members. Now what's nice about that is if you've done your team setup properly in Draftworx, immediately the person reviewing your file will see, okay, Janita is the manager. She has been assigned to review this work on a first level review. So yes, providing more supervision is indeed correct. For example, it's just an example. Okay, and then of course you need to discuss this and communicate this with management, and you need to document management's response over there. Okay, I hope everybody is up to date where I am at now. If this list, remember this list is not exhaustive, okay? So there can be instances where you come across a control activity that we have not listed over here. Rest assured, we've made some space available for you. Just going down a little bit in action 4. So action 4 is where you can document any identified additional entity level controls that we have not covered in the first table. So you are more than welcome to document the control over here, and then you will see you do exactly the same procedures on that control identified. Okay. Now, the most important thing about this working paper is concluding on entity level controls. So firstly, we have, this is action 5, and this would be my overall conclusion on the entity's internal control environment, entity level controls. Okay, so there's 6 considerations that you need to address, you need to work through, and you need to provide an answer for. I'm going to read them with you so that I emphasize to you that this is very, very important. Okay, so firstly, has management, with the oversight of those charged with governance, created and maintained a culture of honesty and ethical behavior? Yes or no? Let's do a yes. Second, does the control environment provide an appropriate foundation for the other components of the entity system of internal control, considering the nature of complexity of the entity? Okay. Number 3, do the control deficiencies identified in the control environment undermine the other components of the entity system of internal control? So if yes, that becomes a little bit problematic. Number 4, is the entity's risk assessment process appropriate to the entity's circumstances, considering the nature and complexity of the entity? Yes or no? Number 5, did the auditor identify risks of material misstatement that management failed to identify? If indicated as a yes, you need to do a little bit more work. So determine whether any such risks are of a kind that the auditor expects would have been identified by the entity's risk assessment process, and if so, obtain an understanding of why the entity's risk assessment process failed to identify these risks of material misstatement. And the work done can be documented in that cell, or if the work is so much and so detailed, please pull in an external Excel, do the work on the Excel, and just hyperlink it to that specific working paper. And then point number 6, is the entity's process for monitoring the system of internal control appropriate to the entity's circumstances, considering the nature and complexity of the entity? Okay. Now, you need to put your final stamp on this. So, overall assessment of the effectiveness of entity level controls. Okay, so yes, the process did fail to identify some risks of material misstatement, and yes, there is some control deficiencies that could undermine other components. But based on that, what do you think about the overall entity level controls? Do you think they are effective, or do you think they are ineffective? Okay, 2 very short but very powerful words. For today, just for simplicity reasons, I'm going to keep it as effective. And then you need to describe the principal reasons for the conclusions reached. Now, a lot of you that knows my training by now, document the method to your madness. Okay, just a little joke. Please don't document that. But your reason for deciding on whether the control environment is effective or not based on the results obtained through walkthroughs and the conclusions reached, you need to document the reasons over there. Okay, now we get to the last section, It is deliberately put at the bottom below the conclusions. Remember, we are dealing with entity level controls. So ultimately, we need to identify overall financial statement level risks. The two goes hand in hand. And now, for the rare scenario that upon evaluating the entity level controls, you can think of a risk at assertion level, you can document it over here. Okay, so we do make room available for you to document any assertion level risks that you can think of whilst doing 1240 in action 6 below. But we do not make room for it at the top because we feel upon assessing the control environment, you will only deal with overall financial statement level risks. Remember, we are getting to section 13 at a later stage. Section 13 will be the control environment, which is more relating to the component. So then you'll be able to identify risks that the control environment can or will not pick up something relating to the component. Okay, so then we can start identifying assertion level risks. Over to you, Dalian.
Janita, I just quickly want to mention one thing on the working paper.
Going back?
There at the bottom at the conclusion, you all have seen that yellow cell, that overall conclusion for the entity controls. Yes, that one.
It was that one.
Yes, it is a very important cell because that conclusion will be pulled forward to when you assess whether you can do test of controls for certain components. So make sure that that conclusion reflects the actual evaluation on this working paper. Very important. Thanks, Shanita.
Cool. Over to you.
Okay. The IT controls, 1240. I think I've discussed basically the first 4 points as 1240 and 1245 looks very similar. What we have added to this working paper is an additional sheet regarding application systems. Now, application systems would be your computer systems that's applicable to or that has an impact on your financial statements. So it will typically be your financial system. You could have a system that deals with inventory. If you are in manufacturing, you might have a separate system that deals with manufacturing that impacts your cost of sales. There might be a separate system for retail purchases, or whatever the case might be. So you need to identify all of these application systems that have an impact on the financial statements or generate information that will go through to the financial statements, even if it's just disclosure. So we identify those systems. Then you need to determine if those systems are complex or not complex. Now, we've given certain criteria that you need to assess. If it comes out that a system is complex, we say that there is a risk arising from the use of IT, and you seriously need to consider the use of an IT specialist, especially if you want to do test of controls, because you'll probably have to test through the systems, and where it's complex systems with different locations and interfaces, that becomes quite complex, and a normal auditor does not necessarily have the knowledge to do that work. If systems are complex, general IT, if you want to do a general IT audit, definitely IT specialists need to be involved. The last step there is we map all the application systems identified to which components get affected on the financial statements. So very important that you understand your entity, you know what information is generated in these application systems, where it goes, what's the reporting routes, and where it ends up. So, Janita, let's go to the working paper. You can just maybe show them the first part and the very important conclusion at the end, and then maybe the application system tab.
Okay, I hope this is big enough and not too big. Okay, so 1245 is split into two sheets. Firstly, we're going to identify the general IT controls and work with that. And then secondly, we're going to focus on the applications that the entity implemented to make their general life easier, their work life easier. Okay, so the first table, very easy. The similar to entity level controls. This is documenting the understanding, walkthrough, assessing design, implementation, whether test of controls can be performed, any weaknesses, exactly the same as we did in 1214. Going down, we also have the section available. If our list did not address any control that your entity has, you are more than welcome to add that to the table in Action 4. And then Action 5 will be our conclusions on the IT controls that we've just evaluated. Okay, all the walkthroughs that we've just performed and the information and evidence that we've gathered. So Action 5, the overall conclusion about the entity's control environment, specifically relating now to IT. Does the entity's information system and communication appropriately support the preparation of the entity's financial statements in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework? So very important, and I've concluded it as being a yes. Overall conclusion about IT general controls, again, this is a yellow cell, and we need to decide those two short but very powerful words, as Dalian said, because it impacts a lot going forward during our risk assessment process, whether the IT general controls is effective or ineffective. I've documented it as being effective, and also you need to provide a reason for why you indicate it's effective. Action 6, same old, risk at a certain level. If you could identify it during the course of your walkthroughs, you're more than welcome to document your risks at a certain level over here. 1245.02, the applications. So you will find in 1245.02, this column has been pre-populated for you with the exception of that cell at the top. That cell indicates, does the entity use this application, and you need to indicate a yes or a no. So you will see that these heading cells are blue, and the reason behind that is you need to indicate the specific application that you are addressing over here. So if your client's main accounting package is Pastel, then you need to indicate Pastel. Or if it's Microsoft Navision, you need to indicate that. Or if it's QuickBooks or whatever accounting system they use, you will need to indicate the name of their application over there. Okay, the second one I've included for today, just because it ties in quite nicely with the risks we've identified and the system descriptions that we've put in, is an asset management add-on module. So for whatever reason, they have a separate asset management tool that they got as an add-on module on Pastel. That is what we're going to assess today. So yes, they are using it. And then you need to go through the characteristics of these IT applications. And you need to document your answers to these questions, ultimately to determine whether this module is a complex system or not. Because remember, as Dalian said, if it's a complex system, then you will need to have the help of an IT specialist. So you'll need to appoint or get the assistance of an IT specialist to audit this application system. Okay, please remember that if you need to appoint an IT specialist to help, that you do Working Paper 1905, Reliance on Auditors Experts, which can be found in our methodology tab, additional templates. You all know those odd working papers that's kept at the back, but you'll need to determine whether you can rely on their work. Okay, so our asset management add-on module, this IT application is complex, and that is based on my answers to the questions over here. And then the answer, should an IT specialist be involved with the testing of the design, implementation, and operating effectiveness? So, i.e., do you need an IT specialist to help you do the walkthroughs? Yes or no? And if it's a complex system, then yes, you need an IT specialist's assistance. Okay. Action 8. You can only perform Action 8 if Action 7 has been completed. Cool, so these pull in from my headings at the top, and then I need to determine which components are now mapped to which system. Okay, and vice versa. So for Pastel, I mean, that is covering everything on my balance sheet and my income statement. I basically can't get a figure to end up on a statement if it's not going through Pastel. Okay, unless you do a little bit of creative accounting, but let's not go into detail. Integrity of management. So do you intend to test controls, yes or no? That's easy as just indicating yes or no. And then which component is actually affected by this application? And I've indicated yes to all my components because it's the main accounting package. For my asset management tool, my add-on module, I've said no to everything except for the asset components, which is depreciation and PPE. So just keep this in mind. Later on when we get to section 13, I'm going to show you where this gets added in to section 13. Okay.
Thanks, Janita. Okay, the new section 13 for system notes. There are some changes on the working paper that I just quickly want to discuss. You would be familiar with the Action 1, laws and regulations and the policies and procedures. What is new is the part to the right that deals with journals. Now, just know that there is a separate system description for journals, number 13.20. So we will document the system for journals once off and not within all the other system descriptions, although we know that journals can affect all components. So what is important here in a specific component, for instance, this one like PPE, you need to understand the kind of journals that is passed for this specific cycle or component. So what are the standard journals? Is it your depreciation? Is it done on a monthly basis? Or is whatever journals might be standard journals? Then also your non-standard journals. It can be that once a year they do a reassessment of useful lives, or there's a derecognition of specific assets. So document the kind of journal so that you just understand, and then that is it for journals. When you do the system description for journals, there you will identify control weaknesses. And when you do the actual work for journals, you already understand how journals are functioning and used throughout the entity. The next action there that's also new is Action 2. It would automatically populate the name of the application system that you have mapped to this cycle and components. And it will also indicate for you there the decision from 12.45 whether you should involve an IT auditor for helping you with the testing of the design and implementation of controls relating to that application system. So you'll see further down when Janita takes us through the working paper, for each control, you need to indicate, is it a manual control or is it an IT control? If it's an IT control, you need to select the application system, and then you can look at this little action to see whether you need the help of an IT auditor to test the design and implementation. Or I say IT auditor, it might just be an IT specialist. Lastly, what is very important regarding the system notes. When you create the audit file, system notes are automatically created for all components and all cycles. Even components and cycles that's not applicable to your audit. let's say for something like biological assets. So you will have to go to those system descriptions that's not applicable, mark them as not applicable to make sure that you don't do unnecessary work, and identify risks that's actually not at all applicable to your audit. In future, we will include a function where only the system descriptions populate that relates to components that is applicable in your audit. Okay, Anita, you can quickly take us through.
Section 13, quite a big section. You'll find all your cycle system notes documented over there, as Dalian said. I just want to show you how easy it is to get rid of a section that you don't accidentally have someone documenting system notes on. Let's take Dalian's example, biological assets. If you open up, for example, the biological asset cycle system note, you can just use the right-hand tool to mark it as not applicable. And then it'll be colored blue in your menu, and everybody knows that blue working papers and blue lead schedules are lead schedules and working papers that's not applicable to the file. So then at least they can see that that should not be documented. For today, I'm going to use 13.30, our fixed assets and investment property cycle or system notes, just to ensure that everything ties nicely in. So laws and regulations, after evaluating that, I said that I couldn't identify any. I've documented my policies. Oh, sorry, let me just zoom in a bit for the people that can't see. For the policies and procedures, I've documented the entities, policies and procedures relating to PPE. And now I need to identify the journals. So the journals, for example, will be monthly depreciation charges, and non-routine journals might be, for example, once a year at year end, they revalue investment property. So investment property revalue done annually. Okay, that would be an example of a non-standard journal entry. So remember, the objective of this working paper is to obtain an understanding of the controls relating to the specific cycle that you're busy with. So that's your goal. Keep that in mind. You need to identify and document as much as possible to ensure that you have a good and proper understanding before attempting to do the field work on this section. Okay, and that is also why we've moved the system notes as part of our risk assessment process or risk assessment procedures now, and not part of the audit program. It was a little bit lost in the cycle indexes. Okay, action 2. You will remember that in 1245.02, I've identified 2 applications and I've mapped them both to PPE. The asset management add-on module is the one that said, okay, that was a complex system and we might need the help, or we do need the help of an IT specialist in testing the design and implementation of this specific IT control. So action 3, I've just identified a few controls. I did a little bit of documentation on a few control activities. So we've grouped the control activities as follows. I just want to show you: initiation, authorization, recording, processing, and reporting. If you want to understand why it's split like that, please make use of the guidance sheet. It's explained quite extensively, so you will have to use the guidance sheet in documenting all these fields on your cycle index, on your cycle system notes. Okay, so there's the description of the specific control, and you need to map it to a component. So I used depreciation. All my fixed asset and investment property components will be listed here, so you'll be able to use the drop down to ultimately select which component is addressed by this control. Okay, then you need to go one step further and identify the assertion that's addressed by this control. So we list all the assertions here. I've selected accuracy and valuation as my assertion to be addressed. Then we get to manual or IT control. So is this a manual control or is it done by the IT system? So the first one I've documented as a manual control, and the second one as an IT related control. If IT, you need to document the related IT application system. So we have two. So this one I'm going to say is specifically related to the asset management add-on module. Now the frequency of occurring, I'm going to say monthly, whether it's direct or indirect, and then the responsible person. Just going to keep that as BBOK. The walkthrough test. Now, because this is a complex system, you will have to obtain the assistance of an IT specialist to evaluate the design and implementation of this control. So the walkthrough test you'll need some help with. Okay, so after appointing the IT specialist, you can now together with them do the walkthrough test on these controls that specifically relates to my application, my asset management add-on module. Okay, I hope that makes sense to everybody. Now we go down to Action 8. Just going to read the orange message to you first, and then I'll explain to you how this comes into play. So Action 8 should only be completed when there is no control in Action 4 above that addresses the significant risk from the risk register in 1505 Action 5. Okay, so very important. If we get to 1505 at a later stage, I'll come back to this and I'll show you what is meant by that orange message. But in a nutshell, any significant risk that you identified on 1505 for which you cannot identify a control that covers that risk, either in 1240 or in 1245 or in section 13.30, my PPE system notes, then you need to document that significant risk over here and also document where that has been communicated to management. Okay, so please make a note in your ear about this. We'll come back to Action 8 later after we've addressed some of the risks in our risk register in 1505. Okay, so were there significant risks which were not addressed by controls? I've indicated that as a yes, so that we have space to come document this later. Now we get to Action 9. Action 9 is a summary of the effectiveness. So it basically summarizes the controls and the risks that you've evaluated at the top. You need to work from top to bottom. You work through every single component that's identified in the controls in the table above. For me, I only have two. You will see here I've identified depreciation, 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 and then PPE overall. Okay, so now focusing on depreciation, I just want to show you how everything now ties into this specific working paper. So you will remember from 1240, my entity level controls, that I've indicated that the overall controls, as Darlene will call them, umbrella controls, was effective. 1245.01, my IT controls, my general IT controls were effective. Now, the IT application control risk assessment, Pastel was not a complex system. The asset management add-on module was indeed a complex system. And now I need to consider, are the control environment and the IT application controls effective to allow for the testing of controls? And only if I say effective here, then I've done the second criterion in ultimately determining whether test of controls will be feasible or not. Okay, so if the control environment are compromised, it will negatively affect the operating effectiveness of manual and IT controls at assertion level, and the auditor will have to assess if the controls per assertion can still be regarded as functionally effective. Very important that you keep that in mind. Okay, now we get to the control evaluation based on the design and implementation testing. So based on the results of my walkthroughs that I've now done with my IT specialist, we've identified 4 controls. 3 of those controls were effective and 1 of them was ineffective. Okay, now how do we reach this conclusion that the overall effectiveness for accuracy and valuation is then effective or ineffective? I'm not going to go through a lot of detail in that because I still feel that's up to your professional judgment and there's no one-size-fits-all kind of scenario. However, if we look at the scenario at hand, we can see that entity level controls is effective. IT controls is effective. So if I have 3 effective controls and 1 ineffective control, I can say, yes, this is effective. The controls pertaining to accuracy, valuation, and allocation is effective. However, if any of your umbrella controls indicated that it was ineffective, I would strongly suggest that you reconsider this conclusion over here. That will then mean that the controls pertaining to the accuracy, valuation, and allocation is ineffective. Okay. But please read the guidance. The guidance is extensive, it's detailed, it's very straightforward, it is very nice. It's like a silent manager to have, like a silent ISA315 specialist to have. The guidance is very informative.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope that the leg stretch was a good one. So up until here, we've went through planning working papers and identifying risks. As soon as we get to 1505, this is where all the identified risks are now coming together. And on 1505, we're going to start the assessment of the risks. Now, just a few things. In general, just take note. ISA315 deal with risk of material misstatements. Okay, so please, when you do identify risks, make sure that it is only the risks with a financial impact. Okay, if there's control weaknesses, communicate that to management, but the risks you identify, make sure that it has a financial impact. So it can have an impact on your financial statements, maybe even leading to a qualification. Okay. What is important on 1505, and just keep that in mind as well, on the very first sheet, there are 3 sections. The first part lists all the risks that you've identified throughout planning, with exception of 2 working papers. I've mentioned it previously. Those 2 working papers are the risks from those 2 working papers that will not be on 1505 is the financial statement level risks that are identified on 1240 and 1245. Those financial statement level risks, immediately on the working paper, we've indicated what's the overall response, and you've documented where you're going to address those risks. So they have been addressed on the working paper, over and done with. Okay. All other risks is then listed on 1505, the first section. The second section make provision for additional risks. Now that additional risks mean any other risks that you should identify during the rest of the audit. Maybe you are busy with execution and all of a sudden you realize there's a risk that I missed during planning and I need to address it. It can maybe even be a fraud risk that you all of a sudden become aware of. Those risks then need to be added, not in the planning, but directly on 1505, the second portion, and then it will follow through the approach going further. You will have to then, obviously, it will update 1605 and 1705 and your audit programs, depending on the assessment of that risk then. Something else that is quite important, the blue fraud risk, business risk refer to the old working papers versus the red significant other component risk is the new working papers, or let's call them ISA315 working papers. We are not distinguishing or dealing with fraud separately. We are now focusing on significant risks and other component risks. So for significant risks, there will be a certain way how to deal with it, and the other component risks, and in the working papers following, we will reiterate how each of these categories of risks are being treated. Okay. Then, when we look at the second sheet on the risk register, 1505, each of the risks that has been listed on the first sheet will pull through, and you will have to then evaluate each of those risks. Assess them to determine, is this risk a financial statement level risk, or is it an assertion level risk? If it's a financial statement level risk, you'll have the same information that you have on 1240 and 1245, where you need to indicate the overall response and say how are you going to implement that response in the working paper and put in a reference to where it has been implemented. If it is an assertion level risk, you will have to determine what is the specific component or components that is affected by this risk, and what are the assertions that's affected, as well as you need to indicate the likelihood and the magnitude. Now, there's detailed guidance on likelihood and magnitude, how to determine, is it a 1, is it a 3, is it a 4? What is important when you do select your components and your assertions, try to indicate the component that is mostly affected. Sometimes it's 2 components. We've provided up until 5, but please make sure that you do not over audit, because if you list 5 components, then you'll have to do, or you increase the risk in 5 components, which will mean work on 5 components, which could have been a duplication, and you don't want to be ineffective in your audit approach. The same with your assertions. You can select all the assertions, but try to do the ones that really get impacted by that risk. Okay, a few things that have changed as well. I indicated in the beginning of the webinar that the assertions has changed. The assertions that you see there now are the ones in ISA315, except for cutoff, which is applicable only to class of transactions or income statement items, and rights and obligations, which is applicable only to account balances or balance sheet items. All the other assertions are applicable to your class of transactions, account balances, and related disclosures. The other thing that changed is just the naming of the risk levels. So we are now talking 1 is low, 2 is a medium, 3 is high, and 4 is significant. Okay. As soon as a risk is stated to be significant, so for significant risks, and this is very, very important, please note that fraud risks are automatically regarded as significant risks in terms of ISA 240. Okay, we have certain risks that we know is always significant, like management override of controls, revenue recognition, unless you rebut a specific assertion in working paper 1270. So here, if your combination of likelihood and magnitude gives you a 4, it would be a significant risk. If it's indicated that it's a fraud risk, you will only be able to select a 4 for likelihood and magnitude. Okay. Then the next requirement with a significant risk is you need to indicate the controls that affect the significant risk and the specific assertion. So where do you get that controls from? Let's say, for instance, your risk here is depreciation is not calculated. Then It will affect my depreciation component. It would affect my accuracy assertion. I go to my system notes. I have a look at all the controls that I've listed there for depreciation specifically, that is addressing accuracy. I read through those controls. I need to determine which of those controls will address my significant risk or prevent the significant risk from actually happening. You can copy that control, then paste it into your working paper 1505. Also from your system notes, then bring forward the conclusion on whether that specific control was properly designed and was properly implemented. If the design and implementation is sufficient, then you will be able to do test of controls, although you can decide not to do test of controls even if the design and implementation is sufficient. And now the big change for significant risks is for each and every significant risks, and that include fraud risk, the auditor needs to design a specific procedure that addresses that significant risk. Okay, so it's not in the like in the past where you had an assertion with 4 and you just select a general procedure. No, this procedure needs to be specific for the specific risk or for the fraud risk. And we give you some guidance on the working paper regarding the direction of testing to make it easier for you to design your procedure correctly. So if the assertion affected is completeness, then you need to know with your direction of testing, you need to design the procedure in such a way that you tell the trainee they need to go and select from the source documents. If it's any other assertion, they need to go write the procedure in such a way that the trainee know they need to make the selection from the accounting records if it is a substantive test of detail. But you can design there also test of controls if your control environment in design and implementation allows for it. And you can also document analytical procedures there. What is important is that you must have a substantive procedure. Okay, you can do test of controls. The substantive procedure can either be an analytical procedure or it can be substantive test of details. Now, in the past, the statement specifically said that you must do substantive test of details only for a significant risk, or at least. Now it doesn't say that anymore. So only substantive procedures, so you can design analytical or substantive test of detail. Before I go over to the other risk, I just want to mention something on journals. We're not going to look at it specifically in the working paper, but I would advise that when you do go to 1505, that just read through journals. We know that journals is a compulsory significant risk in terms of ISA315, where it is management override of controls. So what we've done is we have pre-populated journals for you because it will be a significant risk on all audits. So we've indicated the likelihood and the magnitude of a 4. The part that you still have to do would be to indicate if there are specific controls that address each of those assertions. And remember, all assertions are being affected. And we've also designed the procedures for the both directions for journals for you already. Okay, so you don't have to do that. For all other significant risks, including fraud risk, you will have to still design your own procedures. Okay, now the other risks. So it's any other risk at the assertion level. When you assess it, it is not a significant risk. So it might either be like your likelihood and magnitude is on a 1, a 2, or a 3. For those risks, the result per component per assertion is summarized on a separate sheet. Okay, so you can see here risks are being split. Significant risks are treated one way by designing an audit procedure, and those audit procedures go directly to the audit programs. The other route is all other risks that are not significant. There the risk gets summarized per assertion, per component, and in the next working papers, we will show you how we address the risk per component, per assertion. Okay, now just something which I hope you will never need. There is a bit of a limitation on how many risks you will transfer automatically to 1505. So there's the working papers listed. So for instance, on the first one, 1115, you can raise 25 business risks and 25 fraud risks that will automatically go to 1505. As soon as you identify more risks than the 25, they will not automatically go to 1505, and you will have to add them manually on 1505 in that section to add additional risks. Okay, but I really do hope that you do not encounter audits where you have more than 25 risks on a working paper, because I'm pretty sure that would be a nightmare. Okay, so let's quickly, Janita, if you can take us to 1505. Maybe you'll just zoom in a bit, that it's nice and big, that everyone can see. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So 1505, our newly designed risk register. I really like this. It was a very good improvement from our previous risk registers, and I hope you guys feel the same after we have done the discussion on 1505. Cool. So action one. Action one will be the summary of all the risks that you've identified in your planning section. So in 11 and 12, all the risks will automatically pull in to this section over here. Just to show you what Darlene meant with the journals, the first risk you will find is a pre-populated risk, and that one is the one that she referred to, the journals. Okay. So just so that you know which section in 1505 to go read and familiarize yourself with, that is risk number one. Okay, cool. So the risk summary over here is a section where you now get to scrutinize the risks that you've identified through planning, and then ultimately, if you want to make changes to it, you need to do that on the original working paper. Okay, so it's very nice and summarized here, but if something needs to change, please use the hyperlinks that we've included in this column over here. Jump back to the original working paper, change it, and then come back to 1505 to assess it further. Very important. This is the business versus fraud risk assessment that we've dealt with in the planning. So in 11 and 12, that's just pulling in automatically over here. And then whether it's a compulsory significant risk in terms of ISA315, you need to decide in these cells over here. So I'm just going to say no to all of them. And then ultimately we will have our final business or fraud risk assessment indicated over here. Okay. Then we get the summary of additional risks identified during the course of the audit. So this is for any risks that you can think of that weren't identified in section 11 and 12. So let's say during the execution phase of the audit, during fieldwork, or even during finalization, if you come across a risk that needs to be documented in 1505, so a risk that can cause a material misstatement that has a financial impact, in other words, you should come back to 150501 and document that risk in this section over here. Okay. Then a section you guys are all familiar with is our summary of prior and deleted risks. So if you have a file that already contains risks and you roll it forward into the new RAC, you will find your previous year's risks documented in the third section at the bottom. Okay. Or if you all know our controls that we've put in place, if a risk was deleted in a specific working paper, that risk will still show up at the bottom over here and can only be permanently deleted by the partner. Okay, so very important that you can't just delete risks as you please, they will get summarized over here. Okay, let's jump on to 150502. This is now all my risks that I need to evaluate. So you will see we have risk 1 to 7, which is exactly what we have over here, risk 1 to 7. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit as well so that we can see properly. First risk, the one that relates to journals that Alian said you must please read through, that's contained in here. The revenue recognition, also a pre-populated risk if you haven't rebutted any of the presumptions in 1270. And then we get to a risk that I've identified specifically on my prelim analytical regarding deferred tax. Okay, so going to do that one as an example. So first question is a result as automatically pre-populated from 150501, so whether this is a fraud risk or not. This risk is not a fraud risk. Then secondly, you need to indicate whether the risk can be related to a specific component. The reason for that is we now need to decide whether we find ourselves dealing with assertion level risks or dealing with overall financial statement level risks, because the approach in addressing the risks, evaluating the risks, and designing the responses to the risk differ. Okay. So action 3, due to the fact that I said yes, it can be related to a specific component, this action gets unhidden for us. And we need to decide which component is affected by the risk specifically. And I've indicated deferred tax. As Darlene said, we do enable you to identify up to 5 components, but please keep in mind the moment you identify all 5 fields, we are going to prompt you to consider whether this is not actually an overall financial statement level risk. For today, I'm just going to keep it as deferred tax, and I've determined my likelihood and magnitude as being a level 2 and a level 3. Just to show you where in the guidance that is listed, if you scroll down a little bit in the guidance, you will find that the likelihood assessment is clearly documented in the guidance sheet, and also the magnitude. So 1 is not a thumbs up, there's actually guidance on what constitutes a 1, what constitutes a 2, and then ultimately that is used to calculate our risk of material misstatement. So I've indicated my deferred tax as being a 2, meaning that there were prior year misstatements and they were corrected by management, and my likelihood as a level 3, meaning that the misstatement is above performance or the risk of misstatement, not misstatement, the risk of misstatement can cause the misstatement to be above performance materiality but below overall materiality. Okay. Then I need to document the assertion that this risk specifically relates to. In the standard, they are called relevant assertions. So for today, I've selected my relevant assertion as being accuracy. So now I have a summary over here. I have deferred tax as the component. I have the relevant assertion as accuracy, valuation, and allocation. And I have the overall risk, my ROM, calculated as 2. How the ROM is calculated is basically taking the likelihood and the magnitude, multiply the likelihood and the magnitude, and then divide it by 4, rounded up. So 2 times 3 is 6, divided by 4, 1.5, rounded up to. Okay, just to give you a little bit of a backbone to how that ROM is calculated. Then, of course, this needs to be addressed to management, so communicated to management, and then you'll have to document management's response over there. Our second risk that I want to show you today is depreciation that was not calculated. So my depreciation is not a fraud risk, and I've indicated that it can be related to a specific component. The component I've selected is depreciation. Now, some of you will also think that accumulated depreciation, or PP as a whole, is the other component that's affected by this risk, but it's not in fact the case. As Darlene said previously, it's a knock-on effect of depreciation not calculated correctly. It's the other leg of the journal that we now relate our risk to. Okay. For this I've selected it as a 4 likelihood and a 4 magnitude due to the fact that it's a material component, and my assertions that my relevant assertions is completeness and accuracy. So again, my summary, depreciation, completeness, and accuracy is my identified assertions, and this will be a risk of material misstatement will be a level 4. Okay. Action 4, document management's response over there. And now, due to the fact that this is a significant risk, we need to identify and document the controls that management has put into place to mitigate the risk. Okay. So, for completeness and for accuracy, I need to go back to section 12, where we did 1240 and 1245, to section 13, where we documented my system notes on PPE or on fixed assets as a whole. And then I need to copy in an existing control. Okay, so go back to those working papers, identify the controls that relates to this specific risk, and paste them in here. If, for example, completeness, you'll remember in my 1330, I didn't have controls relating to completeness. All mine only addressed accuracy and valuation. So for the case where you do not have a control, sorry, let's just go down a bit. You do not have a control that addresses completeness for this specific risk. This is where action 8 in working paper 1330 comes into play. You remember I said that you need to make a knot in your ear for all the significant risks that does not have controls mitigating them. Action 8, that is where action 8 comes into play. Okay, so if you can't identify a control that's designed to affect that risk, to mitigate the risk, you need to document that specific risk in action 8. So were there significant risks which were not addressed by controls? Yes. Remember, my risk is a significant risk. I've indicated that it's a level 4 likelihood, level 4 magnitude, and now I need to document that risk over here. Okay, and then also I need to refer to where this was communicated to management. Okay, so very important to know how this section 8 in my system notes work. Okay, going back to 1505, we now need to go even further. We need to test whether the design and implementation of the controls are adequate. So for that one, I'm going to indicate no, and for this one, I'm going to indicate yes. So then this tan message appears. A note, if the design and implementation of any of the controls addressing the assertions above is not adequate, it is not advised that a test of control procedure be designed. So am I going to do test of controls in this case? No. I'm not going to do test of controls. Okay. Action 6. Action 6 is where we now need to design my risk-specific procedure. So no longer having a general procedure covering the risks, I've only tested them at a higher level of assurance with a bigger sample size or whatever the case was. Now I need to design a risk-specific procedure. And I'm going to document my substantive procedure here, either being analytical or substantive test of detail. And then if I have selected to do test of controls, you will have the ability to document your specific test of control procedure as well. If you want to do a second procedure, you are more than welcome to indicate a second substantive procedure. We do cater for up to 3 procedures, okay, but we really doubt that you will have to use all 3. Okay. Then my last example for today is risk number 5. Risk number 5 is not a fraud risk, and I've indicated that this risk cannot be related to a specific component. So the risk ultimately falls into my overall financial statement level risk category. So you'll see, short and sweet, not a lot of work to be done on this specific risk. Basically, you need to select the overall response to the risk at financial statement level. Again, we added in the the exact same drop down like we did in 13, 1240 and 1245. And now based on that, you need to decide, okay, that response, what action am I going to take to ultimately ensure that the response is addressed? And then, of course, reference to where that was done. Remember, your responses to the overall financial statement level risks needs to be evidenced. So please do not identify them and not have proper evidence covering them. Okay, and then again, action 4, need to document what management's response on it will be. Okay, very easy document, very straightforward, and no real hassles on it. 150503. This is now my section covering my prior year and deleted risks. So if all of the risks are summarized on this section, then please note you haven't decided to permanently delete them over here. The moment you indicate that, yes, I would like to permanently delete this specific risk, then that risk will not be covered in 150503. Okay. Now we get to 150504, the risk summary. So in this risk summary, it basically gives you a summary of the assessed risks for each component per assertion. It's very important to note that the significant risk assessment, a level 4, is not included in this risk summary per assertion below. The procedures designed for the significant risks on 150502 and 03 will appear on the respective audit programs for the purposes of obtaining sufficient and appropriate audit evidence to address the significant risk. So remember, you've identified these significant risks. You've already designed the procedure, the risk-specific procedure covering that risk. So it does not help you to ultimately include that level of risk in this risk assessment. Okay, so for example, my deferred tax risk that I dealt with firstly, that was not a significant risk, wasn't a fraud risk. The risk of material misstatement is lower than 4. So I assume that this one will be included in my risk summary. And there we go. Deferred tax is included on my risk summary 150504. So deferred tax, risk level 2, assertion affecting is accuracy valuation and allocation. Okay. Let's go on to the next working paper.
Great. Thank you very much, Janita. The next working paper, 1605, builds onto 1505, that very last sheet that we've seen, the risk summary. So 1505 deals not with significant risks at all. They only deal with the risks summarized per component, per assertion, which is not significant. So the overall risk would be at a maximum of 3. So you can find that you have a relevant component where there's no risk, so all your assertions will have 0 associated to it, or a level 1 or level 3 risk. So what this working paper does is per component, it shows the overall inherent risk per assertion per component, and then it gives the total assurance required. Now, usually one would think if the risk is a 2, then my total assurance required would also be a 2, but there are some exceptions specifically in ISA315, and we'll deal with them on the next slide, and then you'll see on the working paper how it's impacted. And that impact comes from whether the component is the component material or not. Okay. Then for the component, you also need to indicate, do you want to do test of controls? We will actually give you a recommendation, whether from what you've already done on the system notes, whether it would be a good idea to test controls or not, based on your design and implementation summarized per assertion. But as I said, professional judgment, you can decide if you're going to test controls or not. Then it will give you the final level of assurance that is required per assertion, from a 0 to a 3. And what is very, very important on 160501 is that the working paper be signed off by the partner. Okay, and when the partner do that sign off, he's actually making a declaration, and I'm reading the declaration for you. It says, the risk assessment is appropriate. I'm giving permission for the sign off of the component risk assessment and the level of assurance required. Now, if you do not, a partner, sign off 160501, then you will find, if you go further in the working paper, that for all components, the risk will automatically say high as a 3. Okay, so when you get to the working paper and you see that there's a 3 for everything, it either means that the partner hasn't signed off and made his declaration on the risk assessment for the components, or maybe your risk assessment is not complete for a specific component. Okay, let's quickly go to the next slide. Now, I told you that there might be a difference between your overall inherent risk that is coming from 1505 and the total assurance required. That is explained in these 2 bullets, where we deal with material components and immaterial components. So let's quickly look at immaterial components. So if you have a situation where you have an immaterial component and your overall or inherent risk assessment for a specific assertion is 0, so there's no risk, then ISA315 is saying that you do not have to design any further audit procedures, design or perform. Okay, now keep in mind, these are audit procedures that gives you audit evidence. It does not relate to the standard procedures of compiling the lead schedule or looking whether the accounting policy is applicable. Those procedures still need to be performed, but any other procedures which will give you audit evidence, you don't have to do them. Now, I know that quite a few of you would feel uncomfortable in saying, but I'm not doing any work on a component. It might be immaterial, but people could say, I feel uncomfortable. Let's say that balance is not complete. What now? So on the top of working paper 1605, you can make a decision to indicate that for all immaterial components where there is no risk associated to an assertion, you still want to do a procedure for completeness and for presentation at a level 1 assurance. What it will then do is automatically, for all the components that is immaterial with no risk, it will increase your required level of assurance for completeness and presentation from a 0 to a 1, which will mean that you will have to do some testing on those 2 assertions. Okay, that's for immaterial components. Now for material components, if you again have a situation where your inherent risk from 1505 for a component and a specific assertion is 0, so there's no risks associated to this component at all. What ISA 315 paragraph 18 states that, irrespective of the assessed risk of material misstatement, the auditor shall design and perform substantive procedures for each material component. Okay. Now, this is a little bit contentious, and to be honest, the there are different views in the profession of how to deal with this. We say you need to do procedures. Now, one school of thought is saying, if I can do a procedure for one of the assertions of a component, you would adhere to this ISA requirement. The other school of thought is saying, but you need to do work on all of the assertions because it is a material component. Now, at this point in time, we have decided to take the conservative view by saying, if you've got a material component, there is no risk. Automatically, we are going to increase the required assurance to a level 1, which means that you will have to select a procedure for all of the assertions applicable, but small sample sizes only on a level 1. At this point in time, as I say, we are being conservative, and we are actually awaiting some of IRBA's review results to see how do they interpret this paragraph. If they interpret that you only have to do it maybe for completeness and presentation, we will amend the automatic increase of the required level of assurance. But up until then, to keep you safe, we are following this route. Okay, I think, Janita, we can quickly have a look at 1605.
Okay, perfect. So first things first, important things first. The orange message. All significant risks identified in the risk register 1505 are dealt with using specific procedures which address the risk at a risk level in the audit program. Remember, we've designed risk-specific procedures. The items below will address the remaining risk per assertion for each component. See the risk summary per assertion on 150504. Okay, so very important to note that the significant risks, we've already designed our procedures, that's already in the background taken to the audit program. We are not going to expect to see them on this sheet over here. Then, second important item is for those immaterial components which has no relevant assertions. You need to decide whether you want to still do a procedure on completeness and presentation at a low level of assurance, so at a level 1 assurance. The choice is yours. It depends on how uncomfortable that makes you in doing nothing. If doing nothing makes you uncomfortable, put in a yes over there. Okay. So my example for today, I'm going to use investment income. I just want to show you on 1020 that investment income is not material by nature or by amount. So it's an immaterial component. And you'll remember from 1505, we have not identified any risks that related to an assertion in investment income. So please note, I'm going to jump through a few of these examples, but you as an audit firm need to follow a top to bottom approach. Start at the top, start with every single component, check that everything is ready for testing, everything is pulled in correctly. I'm just going to use a few examples today. So investment income, is the component material? No. Okay, we already saw that. So now I would expect that I'm going to have to perform procedures for completeness and presentation at a level 1 assurance due to the fact that I've put in a yes at the top over here. Okay, so there you go. A 1 for completeness, a 1 for presentation. As easy as that. Okay, then the control evaluation based on the design and implementation testing that we've done in section 13. Those evaluations will pull in to that column over here. And then, as Darlene said, we are going to make a recommendation. So whether we think based on your whole control environment assessment starting in 12, going through 13, ending up in 16, do we think you need to do test of controls? So based on that, we still put the ball in your court and we ask you to decide whether you want to do test of controls or not. So these you will see as light blue cells, it's manual input cells. You need to decide whether you want to do test of controls or not. So I just put in no for simplicity reasons. Then the last question, has a significant risk been identified for this component on the risk register 1505? And it pulls in as a no. So this pulls in automatically. You don't have to do anything with it. The only reason why I'm showing this specifically is now you need to develop an expectation that for investment income, you won't find any risk-specific procedures on the audit program. For investment income, I'm going to use my substantive test of detail or substantive analytical sections on my audit program to design procedures that will cover the level 1 completeness and level 1 presentation risks. Okay. Cool. The second example I want to show you today is, of course, depreciation. So yes, that in fact is a material component. You can cross-check that with 1020, where Draftworx has identified that as being a material component. And now we need to determine the risk assessment at assertion level. Okay, so the inherent risks pulling in from 1505, nothing identified there. Remember, the risk we've identified pertaining to depreciation on 1505 was a significant risk. So that has already been dealt with. Significant risks, the procedures that you've designed to respond to that risk will be summarized in your audit program. So that level 4 is not pulling in here. This is the remaining risks. Okay, and now you will see that my control evaluation from 13, specifically 1330, pulls in that the controls relating to PPE is effective. Okay, so recommendation, should test of controls be performed, is a no, but if you still want to perform test of controls, you indicate that yes, I want to do test of controls on depreciation for whatever reason, and then you will see that Draftworx automatically increases your level of assurance required. Because if you keep it at a low level of assurance and you need to do both substantive analytical or detail and test of control, you're going to end up over auditing a bit. So now at least we increase your level of assurance so that the audit program indicates there will be assurance required from test of control and there will be assurance required from either substantive test of detail or analytical. Okay, and then the third example I would like to show you is deferred tax. Remember that the deferred tax was a material component. We identified that in 1020, and my risk assessment from 1505 indicated that I dealt with a level 2 risk. Just quickly to refresh your memory, on 150504, we identified that level 2 risk. So that is now pulling into 1605 in my inherent risk column. The total assurance required to cover that risk is of course a 2, and then the control evaluation recommendation, and now I need to decide whether I want to do test of controls. I've indicated a no, so my final risk of assurance required is indicated in the last column of the table. Has a significant risk been identified for this component? No, which means there's no specific expectation of a risk procedure on my audit program. I'll test this with my general substantive test of detail or analytical procedures. Okay, so please keep in mind you need to start at the top, go to the bottom, and ensure that all the components listed over here has been evaluated and assessed. Very important, as Dalian said, is Action 2 on 160501. This puts the nail in the coffin, and it says that yes, the risk assessment is appropriate. I'm giving permission for the sign-off of components, risk assessment, and level of assurance required. This needs to be done by the engagement partner. Okay, so I am logged in as engagement partner, you will see here. So I had the ability to put in a yes over there and declare that the risk assessment is appropriate. And then, of course, just signing it with our initials and date function, document the engagement partner's initials and date on which the risk assessment has been completed. Okay. So now after that is done, only then will 1705 work properly. So it's very important to note. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but there was a very, very good question raised, and I think we just need to make a very clear point of it.
Cool.
And it was the fact that in 1505 we had this risk on depreciation, and it was actually a significant risk. But now on 1605, we're dealing with lower level risks for depreciation. If we can just give clarity on why that's happening.
Okay.
If you're happy to run with it, otherwise I can answer as well.
Okay, now I'm happy to run with it. It's fine. Thank you, Leon. Okay, so it's very important to note that for any significant risks that we raise, okay, so either it being a fraud risk or a risk that I've identified the likelihood and the magnitude at being a level 4, so a significant risk, we already designed procedures to cover that risk. Remember in here, I'm just quickly going to minimize that. My depreciation was not calculated risk. I said that I can design a procedure to test that risk specifically. And that procedure already in the back path went to your audit program and it's sitting there and waiting for you to execute it. 1605 deals with any other risk other than the significant risks that we've identified. Okay, so yes, the remaining assurance required from depreciation is set at a level low. So if you want to do general audit procedures on depreciation, you're more than welcome to still do that. But the risk response procedure or the risk-specific procedure was already designed and it's waiting for you in your audit programs. I don't know, Darlene, if you want to add anything on that.
In general, I just want to add that you might have, for instance, 5 risks that is related to the component depreciation, of which only 1 is a significant risk, and that will follow the route as Janita has explained. The other 4 risks that are not significant would be summarized here. So we didn't went through each and every risk that Janita has identified and mapped to assertions. In this specific instance, we are seeing that it is, for all the assertions, a 0. Now, the procedure that has been designed for the significant risk is significant risk specific. So it might be that it only addresses a portion of the population of depreciation. Depreciation is maybe not such a good example. So you need to make sure that all the other assertions for a material component you are still doing work on. So that is why this is here increased. I think the significant risk only addressed accuracy and valuation. So all the other assertions need to be increased, and depending on the nature of that procedure that you designed for the significant risk, as I say, if that procedure only addressed a portion of the population, you will still have to do another procedure for accuracy and valuation that address the rest of the population. I don't know if that is answering the question.
Leon, do you have anything to add?
That's great. I think just the point we wanted to make here is that a risk that's significant needs a risk procedure.
Yes.
And that's why we don't consider that as a general procedure when we get to 1605. We've had to, and that's what the standard is telling us. When you have a significant risk, whether it's fraud or a business risk or inherent risk, as the terminology is there, you have to design a procedure that is specific to that risk. Now, previously in RAC, we sort of did that already. In the audit, when you did a fraud risk, we had a little spot there where you needed to document the procedure to address the fraud risk. So it's the same process that's happening here. We just now need to expand it to include business risks that are significant that need this specific procedure now documented. So very good question. And I just wanted to make sure we highlighted that, folks. We don't forget about the significant risks. It's just that by the time we get to 1605, we've dealt with all the procedures for significant risks, and we're now just looking at what is the rest that we need to do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, guys. So also, just to reiterate, this is a material component, so I can't do nothing. Okay, so that's very important to note. I still need to do work on the assertions that's not covered by the risk or that the risk was not relating to. Okay, So that's my third example on 1605. I hope that makes sense. And please, 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 please remember the sign-off is very, very important. If you open up your audit plan, which is 1705, and it looks crooked and not all of your components are visible, then it means you haven't done 1605 properly yet. So please then go back to 1605, document 1605 properly, conclude, sign off, ensure partner signs off and put their initials and date on it, and then only will 1705 work properly. Okay, so please make a note in your ear about that as well. It's very important to remember. Okay, now 160502. This is our summary. This is our big picture. Here we will get our level of assurance that we require and also our intention to test controls. So whether or not we want to test controls will be summarized over here. So before I get into the colors I've added over here, I just want to show you the orange message again. Components with significant risk assessments are not included in the risk summary per surgeon below. The procedures, so those are risk-specific procedures, on 150502 and 150503 will go to the audit programs where you execute the procedure there. Very important to remember that. Okay.
Sorry, can you just zoom again?
Oh, excuse. I need to remember that. Okay. So there we go. The TAN message at the top. Just something also I want to bring your focus on. If all of these low ones shows as a high, then that means that 160501 has not been done properly. Okay, so let's quickly do that and open up 1605. You will see a lot of highs over here, which means you are going to have big sample sizes and test a hell of a lot of items. So it's very important, the sign-off as partner, that it helps your life going forward. So please, if something looks crooked, go back to 1605. Something is wrong in there. Okay, just not in your ear. Cool, so let's look at my 3 examples. Investment income, the immaterial component with no relevant assertions. I've selected to at least do a procedure for completeness and presentation at a low level of assurance. So there we go. That is where those 2 ones come from. Other income followed the exact same principle. So I know that was not one of my examples, but it's now colored green, but it follows the exact same principle. For depreciation, remember, for accuracy, valuation, and allocation, I identified a level 2 risk. So my final level of assurance required to cover that risk will be medium, a level 2. Okay, and have I indicated that I would like to do test of controls? Yes. Okay. So that was this one over here. I just quickly want to show you. For depreciation, yes, I want to do test of controls. That increased it to a medium level of assurance required, and that's the result. Deferred tax, the other one we did on 160501. You'll see that result flowing in nicely. A medium level of assurance required for my testing on accuracy, and I have not indicated that I want to do test of controls on deferred tax. Okay, so very easy and very straightforward. 1605 most probably, if done properly, is one of the easiest working papers in our new RAC. Okay, over to you, Darlene, on 1705.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we are now finished with the risk assessment process. So the significant risks have been assessed in 1505 and responded to with specific procedures. The remaining risks for the component and the assertions have been summarized on 1505, and you have determined what is your overall required assurance, which is summarized. Now, on 1705, which is the audit plan. On the audit plan, all your components will be listed. So just for yourself, maybe do a double check to 1020, where you've identified the components, just to make sure that all components are listed on 1705. There shouldn't be any problems. And then for the components and for the significant risks, it will work separately because we've dealt with them separately up until here. So for the component risks, you need to determine the nature, timing, and extent of the procedures that need to be performed. So nature will refer to either your test of controls, analytical procedures, or substantive procedures, depending on whether you've indicated previously that you want to do test of controls, and whether it is a material component where you have to do some substantive testing. Also then for the components, you need to assign the responsibility for the actual execution work, as well as for the supervision and review. We've made provision for 3 levels of supervision and review, and as we've indicated, for some of, or if you identify the overall financial statement level risk where you say you will increase the supervision and review, that is an ideal place here in 1705 to evidence that you can see the review is not being done by a third-year trainee. It's maybe not even done by a manager, but by the partner himself or herself, depending on what the overall financial statement level risk might have been. Then for your significant risks, those are treated on a separate sheet because we need to also assign the responsibility for performing those procedures for the significant risks. There we are not looking at the extent because we know it is a 4. The timing is still whether it's during interim or final. Most probably you will assign a component or the significant risk to the same person that is responsible for the component. And then what is also important at the end is that this working paper needs to be completed by either the manager or partner that knows the strength of their team, who would be the correct person to deal with the significant risks or which components need to be assigned to which team members. That is basically it. So there is it's not a complicated working paper. Janita will just quickly take us through that.
Okay, so let's look at 1705, the audit plan. So again, please, top to down, you need to address every single assertion. You need to develop a plan on how you want to test every single assertion of a specific component. Some important notes is that this part of the audit plan below does not cater for the significant risks. So it's exactly the same as 1605. The audit plan for significant risks is treated separately. So that can be found in a separate sheet, which is called 1705-03. Okay, so 1705 looks a lot familiar, or here. We are used to this by now, designing our audit approach, indicating the nature, the timing, and the extent of testing. So ultimately ensuring that we have a plan to cover the risks that we've identified and to have a plan to ultimately do the audit program to ensure that the procedures cover the risks that we've identified. Okay, so I'm going to look at depreciation specifically. This is my risk or my level of assurance required based on my risk that's pulling in from 1605. And then whether I've opted to do test of controls or not is also pulling in, like this one over here, from 1605. And now I just need to decide whether I'm going to do substantive analytical procedures or not. So first things first, I'm going to say yes to analytical procedures, yes to substantive test of detail. I require a low level risk. So the moment I indicate a low level of assurance to be obtained from the procedure for both analytical and test of detail, Draftworx is going to tell me that I need to reduce the planned assurance from other testing. So meaning I have a level 1 risk covered with a level 2 assurance. Okay, so I'm over auditing. Okay. Second example is, no, I do not want to do substantive analytical procedures. I only want to do substantive test of detail. And then based on that, I'm going to indicate I can't. So that's very important to note. The moment you try to indicate a level of assurance to be obtained from a test that you're not planning to do, the drop-down is only going to indicate a none, a 0. Okay, because I opted to not do substantive analytical procedures. So for the substantive test of detail, I do have a drop-down. I can select to cover it with a low level of assurance, medium or high. My level of assurance required is low, so I'm going to say low. Okay, but for accuracy and valuation, I'm dealing with a level 2 assurance required. So I can say over here, yes, I would like to do analytical and substantive test of detail, and then I can indicate what level of assurance I would like to obtain from both types of testing. Okay. Again, this is something that we are all familiar with. We all know by now. The audit plan is not very different than what you're used to in the past. It's just, it's not as long, like you have to scroll back and forth the whole time. Okay, 170502. This is the one I want to show you specifically when you identify the overall risks of material misstatement and where you design a response to that risk. Okay, remember in 1240 and 1245. So I've selected in 1240 to provide more supervision.
Just zoom again, please.
Oh, sorry. I thought I'll zoom once I start with the detail, but that's fine. Yeah. Okay, so in 1240, if you can recall, I've decided to address that overall risk procedure by providing more supervision. Okay, so this is now the key opportunity to provide evidence of what I meant by providing more supervision. Now, I can't recall which component. I think it was also depreciation, but now I can indicate that this needs to be done by, let's say, for example, J. Miller, which is the partner. So I'm showing that there's more supervision. Or if you've selected to assign a section to a more experienced staff member, this is your ideal place to start documenting that. Okay, so basically what this working paper entails is you just need to indicate this section's testing, to whom is it assigned, to a trainee or a senior in charge or whatever, manager, whatever the case may be, the first level of review, the second level of review, and then ultimately the final review. Okay, and you can also include nice deadlines. I love this because then everything is at one place and everybody knows what the deadline for their section is. Okay, and that's all that you need to do on 170502. 170503 works exactly the same, with the only difference being that my nature was already dealt with when I designed my risk-specific procedure. So I'm only left with the timing and the extent. So the timing of the procedure, the nature and the extent was addressed by my risk-specific procedure. I'm only left with the timing of the procedure. And then, of course, exact same columns over here that we were used to in 170502, assigning the sections to specific persons, assigning first, second, and third level reviews to specific persons, and ultimately including deadlines so that everybody knows what needs to happen when and what the deadline for this sections and components are. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Janita. Just to let you know, we only have 2 more working papers to go because I know some people are watching the time. So quickly, the risk sign-off was previously 1295, which we've already discussed. So it's moved till the end after the audit plan. So as soon as you sign off this working paper, you will be able to generate the audit program. So the audit programs are still generated the same way. You just need to make sure that in the validation sheet, you have those 3 yeses. Then you will be able to populate your audit programs. If you do find here that certain working papers have not been signed off or reviewed, you need to go back to those working papers, review it, sign it off, so that this working paper can be signed off and the audit programs be generated. Anita, I think we can quickly have a look at 1795.
1795 does not have a lot of changes on it. You are used to confirming the results of documents over here. The most important change is this section at the bottom. The audit evidence obtained from the risk assessment procedure on the working papers listed above provides an appropriate basis for the identification and assessment of the risk of material misstatement. Okay, and you need to confirm. In identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement, the auditor shall take into account all audit evidence obtained from the risk assessment procedures, whether corroborative or contradictory to assertions made by management, and that needs your yes or no. Okay, based on that, we still have the exact same validation principle where if you have 3 yeses, you will be able to populate your audit programs.
Okay, on the audit programs, this is the last working paper we're going to discuss on this webinar today. Audit programs, as soon as 1795 have been signed off, the audit programs can be generated. What you will find on the audit programs, firstly, is your standard procedures that must always be done, and those are referred to your lead schedule to see whether your accounting policies are applicable, and in terms of the standards. These procedures do not provide audit evidence, okay? So even if it is an immaterial component with no risks, and we do not have to select any specific procedures, you still need to perform those procedures on top, your standard procedures. Some of those procedures might not be applicable. For instance, the procedure that looks at the accuracy and completeness of the population. So if you are not doing any substantive tests, that specific procedure would not be applicable. The other things that you will see there is the specific procedures designed for the significant risk. They will populate to the bottom of the audit program. And then for all assertions where you require a level of assurance, the normal process that you are used to by selecting procedures and assigning them to the assertions to balance your audit risk is still in place. There's no change regarding that. So Janita, you can quickly have a look at the audit program. Thank you.
Okay, so again, fixed assets, the one we've dealt with the whole webinar. Standard procedures, same old, test of control, substantive test of detail. And now a section that we've added at the bottom is where you need to execute the procedures that you've designed to cover the significant risks. Okay, so your risk-specific procedures will be covered at the bottom. This is the procedure that I've selected to perform specifically for my depreciation that was not calculated. This procedure was designed in 1505. So if you want to amend something on this procedure, please go back to 1505 and amend it there. Do not try and amend it over here. Okay, and the rest of the audit program remains exactly the same.
Okay, so from our side, I think that was a mouthful. We really tried to give you as much guidance on the working papers itself. So please don't disregard that guidance. For the trainees, before you start a working paper, please read the guidance, or read the guidance as you complete the actions in a working paper. The standard itself is very interesting. Bedtime reading is about 201 pages. So just to mention, but please do contact us if you have suggestions. We would like to hear from you, and please make use of support. We really value your inputs. And yes, I don't know if there's something else, Leon, if you want to conclude, but that is all from myself and Janita. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Janita, Dillian, Damien, helping with the questions in the background there. I think very informative webinar this. Folks, yeah, I think we can't ask the question better. Aren't you glad we're here to help you with ISA315? So please be in touch. As you know about Draftworx, if you haven't seen it before, what our strength is that we can respond to our users' requests and needs and ideas. A lot of what you see in Draftworx is thanks to somebody saying, hey, but what if you guys did? And fill in the blank. It's a new standard. It is daunting. There's a lot of new stuff in there. Please go back, refer to this training video over and over again until you've got it. Ask us the questions. We're here to help. And all the best, folks, for the year ahead as you implement ISA315. See a number of folk who have perhaps not audited or haven't used RAC before. I just want to remind you again, Thursday, please join us for the RAC training. That's a full RAC training from beginning to end. This really, we focused on ISA315. And then if that's still not enough, get in touch with us. We're happy to help organize some additional training for you. So that's all from my side. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Leon, and the Draftworx template development team, Janita, Dalian, also Damien, who was typing them madly away in the background there. And just lots and lots of thank yous coming through. Just to read a few, thank you, everyone. This was very informative, writes Jonathan. Hannes, thank you. This was very helpful indeed. Liesel writes, I'm really looking forward to diving into the audit function. Isn't that fantastic? Anantha, thank you. We'll browse through my version by creating a new file and then seek support if necessary. Thanks again. Yeah, the Draftworx support team is the best you will find. Honestly, they are just amazing. Leon and Janita, Dalian and Damien, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to each and every one of you for participating this afternoon. I think it's been a fantastic session, and we look forward to welcoming you online again on Thursday, as Leon said.
Best of luck.
Bye.
Best wishes for the year ahead. I hope to see you all soon in some training shortly. All the best. Bye-bye.